My name is Alice Pung and I'm a Melbourne born and based writer, and I also teach.
Tell us a little about your heritage. You were born here?
Yes, so I was born in Australia, but my parents are from Cambodia. So they're ethnically Chinese, and they came here in 1980, and my dad survived the killing fields of Cambodia.
How important is your ethnicity to you?
How important? That's a good question. Well, it's part of who I am. You know, I'm born Chinese, Cambodian, Australian, so it's pretty important because my parents are Chinese, Cambodian. That was a household in which I grew up.
What was it like growing up in Australia at that time?
You don't know any different as a kid, but looking back as an adult, it was an interesting household because my parents are survivors. So, you know, over the dinner table or even just in public parks, they talk about people who were smashed, or they talk about the killing fields just as part of their ordinary everyday conversation. The same way my friends' parents would talk about going to a Beatles concert or seeing ABBA when they were growing up. And it was an interesting place. I grew up in Braybrook, which is a suburb that's quite low socioeconomic. And back then in the 1980s, they had a terrible recession. It's a factory suburb, so some of the factories got closed down and a lot of the workers lost their jobs because the manufacturing moved overseas, or they had to find work in Geelong or elsewhere. So that was a tough time back then for the poor working class of Braybrook, but also for the newly arrived Asian immigrants, the boat people. We didn't come from boats, but people from Southeast Asia were either bad news in Asian gangs or we were stealing jobs. And it wasn't a very safe place in Braybrook at that time.
How different do you think it is today? How valued is diversity today?
Oh, it's always been the same. It's part of human nature. Diversity is valued when people feel safe, eh? And I feel this in my own experience. I'm quite educated, I don't have an accent. I work in an area of law that helps minimum wage workers. And so, you know, your average person from a low socioeconomic background, when they weren't, you know, when they weren't advised from the multicultural team at the Fair Work Commission, they don't think, oh, I'm talking to an Asian lawyer or I'm talking to a Croatian. They think I'm talking to someone who's going to help me. Same with doctors, your Indian doctor. So I guess diversity is valued when you feel like it's contributing to your society. It's not. It's looked on with fear when you feel like your livelihood is at threat, people who lost their jobs in Braybrook, or your sense of security. For example, we were considered the bad news back in the 80s, the Asian gangs, so people in Braybrook gave us a hard time. You know, cars would follow us home and say, "Oi, yous, go home, stop stealing our jobs." And
even today, in 2019,
yeah.
How different is it?
It's not that much different in the low socioeconomic suburbs. Not that different at all. I've got friends that still live in Melton and Point Cook and places like that. That kind of overt racism still exists just because people feel threatened.
What about in terms of discrimination? Have you ever felt discriminated against yourself?
Yes, I have, yeah. And, you know, I remember being young as a teenager. You get horrible things shouted at you just when you're minding your own business. So I'm the oldest of four. I sometimes had to look after my younger siblings, and sometimes I'd be at High Point with, you know, my two younger sisters, one in a pram, I'm carrying one, and I get really dirty looks for being a breeder, for, you know, coming here and having lots of babies when they weren't mine. And you know, you couldn't tell people that, or you'd get yelled at in the streets.
And what about as you got older?
I thought I'd be immune to that, Ali. I thought, oh, when I get older, when I get a career and I'm successful, then people think I make this country proud. But only just recently, when I was very pregnant with my first son, someone put a little poster on our car windscreen, and my husband looked at it because I thought it was just advertising, and he wouldn't let me look at it and said, I'm going to see if other cars have it. So he walked around the car park and no other car had this in Bunnings, and I grabbed it off him. I said, what is this? Is it advertising? And I looked at it, and someone took the care to make this little black and white photocopy poster of a really sweet looking white girl and a black boy, and they were hugging in a big circle. There was a cross over them and it said, "Stop race mixing," clearly intended for me because I was heavily pregnant and, you know, I was going to have bicultural kids. I don't know who does that, but my husband was really, really quite alarmed by it.
Were you astounded that that happened in 2019?
Not really, because I grew up in Braybrook where people chucked a rock through our window. So I thought, this guy is a coward. He's too scared to confront a woman who can't even walk properly, who's wobbling along. No, I wasn't astounded. I remember my friend Christos Teolkas wrote this wonderful essay about refugees, but he made this interesting point about how people who support refugees live in the inner city, yeah? And they probably don't have much interaction with refugees because their kids go to these, you know, quite very academically based state schools with baking fairs. And then when the refugees come, they get sent to the far-flung suburbs, Melton, Point Cook, Albury, Wodonga, and it's the people that the inner city people say, "Oh, these people are so racist, they're bogans or they're redneck farmers." These are the people doing the actual integration. They have to live next door to the new Hmong refugees or the new Burmese refugees, people from Sudan. And when those people try and have a say and say, "Oh, look, we're not coping really well. It's really, you know, these neighbours are awful," they get accused of being called racist. So it's more complex. I understand that racism is very nuanced, and people who are supposedly espousing racist views don't necessarily have racist hearts. It's not making an excuse for racist people. It's just saying that people believe the hype and the ideology, and then some people live with the reality of integrating. Yeah.
What is it that allows those barriers to be broken down? Is it greater integration? Is it assimilation? What is it that can change that?
Well, I think people should put their actions where their mouth is. You know, as a writer, I know how easy it is to express positive sentiment and to have your views align with the right cause, be it left or be it right wing. But people who support immigration should go out and befriend immigrants. People who support refugees should actually have at least one or two refugee friends instead of, I've been to parties where everyone is a different race and a different ethnicity and class to me. I'm the only Asian, and they're saying these positive things about refugees. But then I realise their kids don't go to school with refugees. Their kids don't interact with the people they try and help. And that's what humanises you, is when you interact with people that you might be a bit afraid of.